When Arthur inherited his grandfather's shattered tall case clock, he thought it was a cruel final joke from a bitter old man. He nearly sold it to a junk dealer for $50. If he had, he would have handed over a multi-million-dollar empire and practically signed his own death warrant. Arthur Pendleton sat in the leather-backed chair of a mahogany-paneled office in downtown Providence, Rhode Island, feeling entirely out of place. His suit was a decade old, fraying at the cuffs, a stark contrast to the immaculate surroundings of Gable and Hughes, estate attorneys. Across the desk sat Harrison Gable, a man whose hourly rate probably exceeded Arthur's monthly rent. Arthur's grandfather, Theodore Carmichael, had passed away 3 weeks prior at the age of 92. Theodore was an eccentric, a master horologist who had spent his life repairing antique timepieces in a dusty shop on Thayer Street. He was also notoriously paranoid, entirely estranged from the rest of the family, and according to neighborhood rumor, wealthy beyond measure. Arthur, struggling under a mountain of debt from a failed restaurant venture and drowning in past due notices, had secretly hoped for a lifeline. Just a few $1,000s could save his apartment from eviction. "As you know, Arthur," Harrison Gable began, peering over his half-moon spectacles, "your grandfather was a particular man. His assets were largely liquidated in the final years of his life. The proceeds, amounting to roughly $2.4 million, have been donated in their entirety to the New England Horological Society." Arthur felt the air leave his lungs. 2.4 million. Gone. "However," Gable continued, sliding a single heavy piece of parchment across the desk, "he did leave a specific bequest for you, the only physical item he refused to liquidate." Arthur leaned forward. "What is it?" "Item 4 in the addendum," Gable read aloud. "To my grandson, Arthur Pendleton, who always possessed more curiosity than sense, I leave the 1890 Gustav Becker tall case clock, currently residing in the front parlor of my home. It is broken. Let him fix it, or let it remind him that time waits for no man." Arthur stared at the lawyer, waiting for the punchline. "A broken clock. That's it? He left me a broken clock?" "I have the keys to the property. You have 48 hours to remove the clock before the estate is formally transferred to the bank," Gable said coldly, handing over a brass key. The Carmichael house was a crumbling Victorian monstrosity that smelled of beeswax, old paper, and decay. When Arthur arrived that evening, the rain was coming down in sheets. He found the clock in the front parlor, exactly as described. It was a massive thing, standing nearly 8 feet tall, crafted from dark, heavily carved walnut. The glass door protecting the pendulum was shattered, the wooden casing was deeply scratched, and the intricate moon phase dial was jammed. The brass weights lay at the bottom of the case like dead iron. It was hideous, it was heavy, and it was completely worthless. Arthur cursed his grandfather's memory as he and a hired buddy, Tommy, wrestled the behemoth into the back of a rented U-Haul. They hauled it up 3 flights of stairs to Arthur's cramped one-bedroom apartment, where it took up an entire wall of his tiny living room, looming over him like a dark, silent judge. The next morning, Arthur took photos of the clock and posted them on a few antique forums and local online marketplaces, listing it for $200. He figured he could at least get grocery money out of the old man's final insult. Within 20 minutes, his phone rang. "Mr. Pendleton?" The voice was smooth, polished, and unnervingly calm. "My name is Richard Lawson. I am an independent appraiser and collector of German timepieces. I saw your listing for the Gustav Becker." "Yeah," Arthur said, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "It's busted. Glass is broken. Mechanism is jammed. $200 you haul it. I will give you $10,000 for it, Lawson said without missing a beat. Cash, today, in an hour. Arthur froze. $10,000? For a broken piece of wood and brass? A desperate electric jolt of adrenaline shot through his chest. 10 grand would solve almost all his immediate problems. It would stop the eviction. It would get the bill collectors off his back. Hello? Mr. Pendleton. Arthur looked at the clock, the scratched wood, the shattered glass. Why would an appraiser offer $10,000, unseen, for a damaged clock worth maybe $500 in mint condition? Theodore Carmichael didn't do anything by accident. Let him fix it, or let it remind him. I think I'm going to hold on to it for a bit, Arthur stammered. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. When Lawson spoke again, the polite veneer had cracked, revealing something sharp and metallic underneath. Mr. Pendleton, I strongly advise you to reconsider. That clock is unstable. The weights are lead-lined, and the casing is prone to dry rot. Let me take it off your hands. $15,000. It's not for sale, Arthur said firmly, and hung up. His heart was hammering against his ribs. He walked over to the clock, running his hands over the dark walnut. It wasn't just a clock. If someone like Richard Lawson was willing to drop $15,000 blindly, there was a reason. Arthur's grandfather was paranoid. He didn't trust banks. He liquidated $2.4 million. But where did his actual fortune, the generational wealth he'd supposedly hoarded for decades, go? Arthur fetched his toolbox. It was time to fix a clock. Arthur had zero experience with horology, but he had YouTube, a set of precision screwdrivers, and a burning, desperate curiosity. He started by carefully removing the shattered glass, sweeping the shards into a dustpan. He removed the pendulum bob, a heavy disc of polished brass, and set it on his kitchen table. Then he unhooked the 2 massive cylindrical weights. As he lifted the right weight, he noticed something odd. The left weight was solid, incredibly heavy, typical for a clock of this size. But the right weight, the one that powered the chime mechanism, felt hollow. It was lighter by at least 5 pounds. Frowning, Arthur laid the brass cylinder on a towel and examined it under his desk lamp. The top cap of the weight, where the hook was attached, had a tiny seam. It wasn't a solid cast. It was threaded. Using a pair of rubber-gripped pliers, Arthur clamped down on the brass cap and twisted. It was stiff with decades of grime, but with a sharp crack, the threads gave way. He unscrewed the cap and tipped the cylinder over. A shower of small, heavy objects hit the towel with a muffled clatter. Arthur gasped, stepping back, his mind struggling to process what he was looking at. Resting on the terrycloth towel were roughly 50 gold coins. They weren't modern. They were heavy, stamped with eagles and faces from a bygone era. He picked one up with trembling fingers. United States of America. $20. 1907. A high-relief double eagle. Even Arthur, with his limited knowledge of numismatics, knew that these were incredibly rare. A single coin could be worth tens of thousands of dollars. There were 50 of them here. He had just found over $1 million hidden inside a clock weight. But the clock wasn't finished giving up its secrets. Arthur stared at the Gustav Becker, its empty casing now feeling less like a piece of furniture and more like a vault. He pulled up a chair and peered into the intricate brass gears of the clock face. The moon dial, a painted disc showing the phases of the moon, was jammed, sitting half exposed at the top of the arch. Arthur remembered his grandfather's meticulous hands, the way Theodore always tapped the side of his workbench 3 times before opening a tricky pocket watch. Arthur reached up and pressed his thumb firmly against the painted moon. It didn't budge. He pressed harder, pushing it to the left. With a loud clack, the moon dial snapped into place. Immediately, the gears whirred to life. The hands on the clock face spun wildly, unmoored from the pendulum's regulation, spinning round and round until they stopped dead at 12 o'clock. A deep, metallic click echoed from the bottom of the wooden case. Arthur knelt down. The solid wooden base of the clock, the thick pedestal it stood upon, had popped open a fraction of an inch. It was a false bottom. His hands were shaking violently as he wedged a flathead screwdriver into the gap and pried the heavy oak panel up. Beneath the false floor lay a shallow, zinc-lined compartment. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, its pages brittle and yellowed, and a velvet pouch tightly bound with a leather cord. Arthur grabbed the pouch first. He untied the cord and poured the contents into his palm. 4 massive uncut gemstones tumbled out, catching the weak light of his living room. They were sapphires, deep oceanic blue, and roughly the size of quail eggs. He was rich, more than rich. He was holding generational wealth, completely untraceable, completely off the grid. Theodore hadn't donated everything. He had hidden his true fortune in plain sight, trusting that his grandson would be just desperate and curious enough to find it. Arthur reached into the compartment and pulled out the ledger. He opened to the first page. It wasn't a diary. It was a list of names, dates, and locations. August 14th, 1982. Boston. Lawson Foundation. 400,000. September 2nd, 1989. Philadelphia. D.C. Higgins. 1.2 million. October 11th, 1995. Providence. Richard Lawson. The Romanov Peace. Arthur's blood turned to ice. Richard Lawson, the man who had called at him earlier. The appraiser. He was in Theodore's ledger, dated nearly 30 years ago. Beside his name was an asterisk and a single sentence scrawled in Theodore's sharp handwriting. He suspects the Becker case. If I die before it is moved, he will come for it. A sudden sharp knock at the apartment door made Arthur jump, nearly dropping the ledger. He scrambled to his feet, kicking the gold coins under the towel and shoving the ledger into his waistband. The knock came again, louder this time, commanding. "Arthur?" A voice called through the thin wood of the door. It was the smooth, polished voice from the phone. Richard Lawson. "Arthur, I know you're in there. I saw the U-Haul receipt. Open the door. I want to make you a very generous offer, one you cannot refuse." Arthur backed away from the door, his eyes darting around the small apartment. He was on the 3rd floor. There was no fire escape. "Arthur," Lawson's voice dropped its polite tone, adopting a chilling, dangerous edge. "That clock doesn't belong to Theodore. It never did. Now open the door, or I'll open it for you." The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the hallway. Lawson was picking the lock. Arthur looked at the shattered clock, then at the heavy brass pendulum bob resting on his kitchen table. His grandfather hadn't just left him a fortune. He had left him a war. The lock cylinder on Arthur's front door gave a sharp, metallic click. The brass knob began to turn. Arthur's mind raced, his survival instincts finally overpowering his shock. He was trapped in a 3rd-floor apartment with no fire escape, holding a fortune in untraceable gems and a ledger that a ruthless collector was clearly willing to kill for. He needed a weapon. His eyes fell on the kitchen table. The Gustav Becker's pendulum bob, a polished disc of solid brass weighing nearly 8 pounds, sat innocently next to his coffee mug. He grabbed it, the cold metal heavy and reassuring in his grip. With his other hand, he shoved the leather-bound ledger, the velvet pouch of sapphires, and the handful of loose gold coins into his battered canvas backpack. The apartment door swung inward with a violent crash, splintering the doorframe. 2 men stepped into the cramped living room. The first was undeniably Richard Lawson. He was in his late 60s, dressed in an immaculate charcoal bespoke suit, his silver hair perfectly coiffed. He looked like a Wall Street executive, but his eyes were cold, flat, and devoid of any human warmth. Behind him stood a much larger man, a hired enforcer whose broken nose and thick neck practically screamed violence. Let's call him Collins. Lawson's eyes immediately darted past Arthur, landing on the gutted Gustav Becker clock and the pried-open false bottom. A flash of pure, unadulterated rage twisted his aristocratic features. "You opened it!" Lawson hissed, his polished veneer completely dissolving. He stepped forward, his gaze sweeping the floor. "Where is it? Where is the Roman? Man of peace." Arthur backed up, his grip tightening on the brass pendulum. "I don't know what you're talking about. There was nothing in there but dust." "Don't lie to me, Mr. Pendleton," Lawson barked, gesturing sharply to Collins. "Check the casing. He wouldn't have had time to decipher the secondary locking mechanism. Theodore was a paranoid fool, but he was thorough." Collins lunged toward the clock. As he did, Arthur saw his opening. He didn't swing at the massive enforcer. Instead, Arthur hurled the 8-pound brass pendulum directly at the room's single large window, overlooking the street. The glass exploded outward with a deafening crash, showering the pavement 3 stories below. The sudden noise and the blast of cold, wet wind startled both men. Collins instinctively raised his arms to shield his face from the flying shards. Arthur didn't hesitate. He dropped his shoulder and sprinted directly at Lawson, barreling into the older man's chest. The impact knocked the wind out of the collector, sending him crashing into the drywall. Arthur scrambled over him, bursting through the splintered doorway and into the dimly lit hallway. "Get him!" Lawson wheezed from the floor. Arthur took the stairs 3 at a time, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He heard Collins's heavy boots thundering down the wooden staircase behind him. Arthur hit the ground floor lobby, shoved open the heavy security door, and spilled out into the rainy Providence night. He darted down a narrow alleyway, weaving through overflowing dumpsters and chain-link fences, his knowledge of his own neighborhood his only advantage. After 20 minutes of blind, breathless running, he ducked into the detached garage of his best friend, Tommy. Soaking wet and trembling violently, Arthur collapsed onto a pile of old moving blankets, clutching his backpack to his chest. He pulled out his phone. 3 missed calls. One was an unknown number, likely Lawson. He needed to understand exactly what he had stumbled into. He unzipped the backpack and pulled out Theodore's weathered ledger. Under the beam of a greasy work light, Arthur began to read. The ledger was a meticulously documented history of horrors and salvation. Theodore Carmichael hadn't just been a watchmaker. He had been a highly skilled recovery agent for stolen antiquities during the Cold War. He used his legitimate business as a front to intercept, verify, and hide priceless artifacts that black market syndicates were attempting to smuggle into the United States. Arthur flipped to the final pages, his eyes scanning the elegant, faded ink until he found the heading, "The Romanov Piece." According to Theodore's notes, the Romanov piece was not a clock. It was an imperial treasure commissioned by Tsar Nicholas II in 1914, a mechanical Fabergé egg encrusted in diamonds and containing a solid gold automaton of a singing nightingale. It was thought to be destroyed during the Bolshevik Revolution, but Theodore had intercepted it in 1995 from a Russian oligarch looking to quietly liquidate it in America. The middleman for that deal? Richard Lawson. Theodore had stolen it right out from under Lawson's nose to prevent it from vanishing into a private illegal collection forever. Arthur read the final underlined entry regarding the Gustav Becker clock. The failsafe. Lawson knows the Becker holds the egg. He does not know the mechanism. The true vault is housed within the solid oak canopy of the clock, sealed by a kinetic lock. The key. The solid left weight must be raised to the exact height of the lunar dial. The chime barrel must then be wound counterclockwise, against the grain of the gear. The warning: if the casing is breached by force, or if the secondary gears are engaged improperly, the lead weight will drop, shattering the vial of corrosive acid housed above the titanium vault. The Romanov piece will be destroyed. If I cannot protect it, no one shall have it. Arthur stared at the page, a cold sweat breaking out over his forehead. Lawson didn't have the egg. It was still inside the clock, sitting in Arthur's apartment. His phone buzzed in his hand. It was a text message from an unknown number. It contained a single photo. It was a picture of Arthur's gutted apartment. Standing in the center of the room, looking terrified with a bruised cheek, was Tommy. Lawson had found him. The accompanying text read, "Your friend came looking for you. Bring the ledger to your grandfather's workshop on Thayer Street in exactly 1 hour, or the boy pays for your grandfather's sins." The rain had stopped by the time Arthur arrived at Thayer Street, leaving the cobblestones slick and gleaming under the amber streetlights. Theodore's shop, Carmichael Horology, sat squished between a modern cafe and an empty storefront. The front window was blacked out, the closed sign hanging crookedly on the door. Arthur pushed the door open. The bell above chimed a hollow, lonely note. The inside of the shop smelled of brass polish, old wood, and ozone. Clocks of every size and era covered the walls, their faces frozen, their pendulums still. In the center of the room, illuminated by a single, harsh halogen work light, stood the Gustav Becker. Lawson's men had transported it from Arthur's apartment. Standing beside the towering clock was Richard Lawson. Collins was in the corner, holding a terrified Tommy by the collar of his jacket. "Arthur," Lawson said smoothly, adjusting his cuffs, "I'm so glad you decided to be reasonable. Hand over the ledger, and your friend is free to walk out of here." "Let him go first," Arthur demanded, his voice shaking slightly, though his grip on the leather-bound book remained firm. Lawson chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "You aren't in a position to negotiate. I have spent 30 years looking for that egg. Theodore humiliated me. He stole a $50 million prize and hid it in a piece of German trash. Now, I will ask you one last time. Give me the book." Arthur took a slow breath. He knew if he handed over the ledger, both he and Tommy were dead. Lawson was not leaving loose ends. Arthur had to use Theodore's genius against him. "The book doesn't matter if you don't know how to read the schematics," Arthur lied smoothly, taking a step closer to the towering clock. "The vault is kinetic. If you try to smash it open, you'll trigger a fail-safe. A vial of industrial acid will shatter, melting the gold and destroying the diamonds." Lawson's eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing." "Am I?" Arthur challenged, tapping the heavy wooden canopy of the clock. "My grandfather was a master horologist. Do you really think he'd just put a $50 million egg in a wooden box without a trap? I know how to open it. I read the book. Let Tommy go, and I'll give you the egg." Lawson stared at Arthur for a long, tense moment. The greed in the older man's eyes eventually won out over his caution. He nodded to Collins. "Let the boy go." Collins shoved Tommy forward. Tommy stumbled, looking back at Arthur with wide, panicked eyes. "Arthur, what are you doing?" "Get out of here, Tommy," Arthur said firmly. "Go." Tommy didn't need to be told twice. He sprinted out the front door, the bell chiming wildly in his wake. "All right," Lawson said, pulling a suppressed pistol from his jacket pocket and aiming it loosely at Arthur's chest. "Open it! Now!" Arthur stepped up to the Gustav Becker. His heart was a drum in his ears. He remembered the exact wording in the ledger. To open the vault, the left weight must be raised to the exact height of the lunar dial. The chime barrel must then be wound counterclockwise. But Arthur wasn't going to open the vault. Before coming to the shop, Arthur had made a phone call to Detective Miller of the FBI's Art Crimes Division, sending photos of the ledger pages detailing Lawson's smuggling history. But the police were still minutes away. Arthur had to disarm Lawson. Arthur grabbed the heavy chain attached to the solid left weight. He pulled it, hoisting the lead cylinder up until it was perfectly aligned with the painted moon dial at the top of the casing. "The lock requires immense tension," Arthur explained, his voice eerily calm as he reached into the brass gears. He found the primary chime barrel. "If I turn this clockwise, the vault opens, but if I misalign it by even a fraction—" "Don't play games with me," Lawson snapped, stepping closer, the gun raised. "Turn it." "Okay," Arthur said. He gripped the brass barrel. Instead of turning it to release the vault, Arthur deliberately gripped the release lever for the mainspring, the massive coil of tempered steel that held the immense tension of the heavy lead weight. He yanked the lever backward. The resulting sound was not a click. It was a violent, explosive snap that echoed like a shotgun blast inside the small shop. Decades of kinetic energy, stored inside the heavy steel mainspring, released all at once. The brass gears of the clock face stripped instantly, exploding outward in a shower of jagged metal shrapnel. Collins roared in pain as a jagged piece of a gear sliced across his cheek, blinding him in a spray of blood. But the true trap was the left weight. With the mainspring shattered, the restraining gear vanished. The 50-pound solid lead weight plummeted straight down the chute. Lawson, startled by the explosion of the gears, had instinctively lunged forward to protect the clock. His hand was resting squarely on the bottom ledge of the wooden casing. The lead weight slammed into the base with the force of a falling anvil. It crushed straight through the wooden paneling and squarely onto Lawson's hand. The sickening crunch of shattering bone filled the room, followed instantly by Lawson's agonizing, ear-piercing scream. He dropped the pistol, collapsing to his knees as he desperately tried to pull his pulverized hand from beneath the heavy lead block. Arthur didn't wait to admire his handiwork. He dove to the floor, snatching up Lawson's discarded pistol. He scrambled backward, aiming it squarely at Collins, who was clutching his bleeding face. "Stay down!" Arthur screamed over Lawson's howling. "Stay on the ground!" Through the shattered front window of the shop, the strobing red and blue lights of multiple police cruisers suddenly illuminated the darkness. Sirens blared, growing as deafeningly loud as tactical teams swarmed the sidewalk. Detective Miller had arrived, right on time. Arthur slumped back against a display case, breathing heavily, the adrenaline finally beginning to ebb, leaving him exhausted, but alive. 2 weeks later, Arthur sat in the same mahogany-paneled office at Gable and Hughes, estate attorneys. This time, he wasn't wearing a frayed suit. He wore a sharp, tailored navy blazer, and he exuded a quiet, undeniable confidence. Harrison Gable looked at him with newfound respect. "The FBI has formally seized the Fabergé piece, Arthur. It will be returned to the Russian Cultural Heritage Foundation next month. Richard Lawson is currently residing in a federal holding facility, facing a litany of charges spanning 3 decades. "And the reward?" Arthur asked, sipping his coffee. "As stipulated by international recovery laws," Gable continued, adjusting his glasses, "the finder's fee for an antiquity of that magnitude, especially one securing the arrest of a major black market syndicate head, is substantial. The Foundation has agreed to a sum of $2.5 million. It seems your grandfather ensured you got your inheritance, after all." Arthur smiled softly. Theodore Carmichael had been a paranoid, difficult man, but he had also been a genius. He hadn't just left his grandson a fortune. He had tested him. He had given Arthur the tools to conquer his fear, outsmart a monster, and reclaim his own life. Arthur walked out of the law office and into the bright Providence sunshine. In his pocket was a velvet pouch containing 4 uncut sapphires, and safely hidden in a secure deposit box were 50 pristine gold double eagles, a little extra insurance that Uncle Sam didn't need to know about. He checked his wrist. He was wearing a vintage 1960 Omega Seamaster, beautifully restored, ticking with perfect, unwavering precision. Time was finally on his side. Did Arthur's grandfather pull off the ultimate posthumous heist? If this hidden treasure story had you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. What would you do if you found a secret compartment in an old heirloom? Let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to share this dramatic twist with your friends and subscribe to the channel for more unbelievable real-life mysteries and thrilling stories every single week.